I can still hear the sharp click of dress shoes against marble floors and the low murmur of voices from that emergency board meeting. The mahogany conference table in Davidson Industries' 42nd floor boardroom reflected the city lights. Below, casting shadows across faces that hadn't taken me seriously in the 8 years since I'd left the Army. My brother Marcus sat at the head of that table, his Armani suit perfectly pressed, his Yale MBA diploma practically glowing behind. Him on the wall. He wore that same arrogant smirk he'd carried since we were kids, the one that said he was born for this corner office while I was just the soldier sister who'd never understand real business. The irony wasn't lost on me that this very room, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, would become the stage for the most satisfying 30 minutes of my entire life. But nobody in that room knew what was coming. Not Marcus, not the board members, not even our father who'd built this company from nothing 40 years ago. They all saw exactly what they'd always seen. Sarah Davidson, the middle-aged former Army logistics officer who'd spent 12 years overseas, who came home with nothing but a duffel bag and a head full of military discipline that supposedly meant nothing in the corporate world. Marcus had made sure everyone knew his version of the story. Sarah tried the military thing. Couldn't. Hack civilian life, needed Dad to give her a job in operations. Sarah, who wore practical flats instead of heels, who kept her graying hair in a simple ponytail, who drove a 10-year-old Honda instead of a BMW. Sarah, who lived in a modest townhouse 20 minutes from headquarters, while Marcus owned a penthouse downtown and a lake house in Wisconsin. Sarah, who'd been divorced twice, who had no kids, who spent her evenings allegedly watching Netflix instead of networking at exclusive country clubs. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that those evenings were spent in video. Conferences with manufacturing executives in 12 different states. Those practical flats had walked through more factory floors than his Italian leather had ever touched. That modest townhouse was actually the registered address of 3 separate consulting firms that had quietly revolutionized supply chain operations for half the Fortune 500. And that 10-year-old Honda had driven me to meetings that would ultimately reshape everything they thought they knew about business success. The company Marcus thought he was destined to inherit, Davidson Industries, manufactured industrial equipment and components. Dad had started it in 1984 with a single contract to supply parts for agricultural machinery. By the time Marcus graduated from Yale in 2010, the company was pulling in $50 million annually and employed over 400 people. Marcus stepped into the role of vice president of sales and marketing like it was a throne built specifically for him. The golden boy with the MBA, the networking skills, the country club connections, and the complete confidence that came from never having to prove himself to anyone. I'd come home from my final deployment in Afghanistan in 2015 at age 38, ready to figure out what civilian life looked like after spending my entire adult life in uniform. Dad offered me a position in operations, managing inventory and coordinating with suppliers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and after years of managing complex logistics in war zones, civilian supply chains felt almost laughably simple. Marcus made jokes about me finally learning real business, and Dad just smiled, happy to have both his children under the same roof again. What they didn't understand was that 12 years in Army logistics had taught me something invaluable. How to see inefficiencies that others missed, how to streamline complex systems, and how to build relationships with people who actually got things done rather than people who just talked about getting things done. While Marcus spent his days in presentation meetings and golf games with potential clients, I was on factory floors, in shipping warehouses, and on phone calls with plant managers who could tell me exactly why their costs were higher than they needed to be. Within 6 months of joining Davidson Industries, I'd identified 17 separate areas where we were hemorrhaging money due to outdated processes and supplier relationships that existed more out of habit than efficiency. I'd found 3 new suppliers who could provide the same quality materials for 30% less cost. I'd discovered that two of our biggest clients were actually subsidiaries of companies that could provide us with raw materials, creating opportunities for partnerships that nobody had ever explored. But I didn't announce these discoveries in boardroom presentations with PowerPoint slides and projector screens. Instead, I quietly started implementing changes, testing new processes, and building relationships that would prove their value through results rather than promises. When our quarterly numbers started improving, Marcus took credit for his new marketing initiatives. When our production costs decreased, Dad praised our entire team's dedication. Nobody looked twice at the operations manager who was just doing her job, keeping her head down, staying in her lane. The real transformation began in year 2, when I realized that the inefficiencies at Davidson Industries weren't unique to our company. Every manufacturer in our sector was dealing with similar problems: outdated supplier networks, inefficient transportation logistics, and communication gaps between different levels of production. There was an entire industry of consultants who claimed to solve these problems, but most of them had never actually worked in operations. They had theories and frameworks and expensive software solutions, but they'd never spent 3 months in Kandahar coordinating supply convoys through active combat zones. That's when I started taking on consulting projects under the name Summit Operations Solutions. Just small contracts at first, helping regional manufacturers optimize their supply chains. I'd work evenings and weekends, using vacation days to visit client facilities, building a reputation one successful project at a time. The beauty of the consulting world was that results spoke louder than credentials. Nobody cared that I didn't have an MBA from an Ivy League school if I could cut their operational costs by 20% and improve their delivery times by 40%. Marcus, meanwhile, was busy building his profile within the industry. He joined the Chicago Manufacturing Association, spoke at trade conferences, and developed what he called strategic partnerships with other companies in our sector. He hired an assistant, moved into the largest office on the executive floor, and started talking about expansion plans that would double our revenue within 5 years. Dad was proud. The board members were impressed. Industry publications featured Marcus in articles about rising stars in manufacturing leadership. What Marcus didn't realize was that several of those strategic partnerships he was so proud of had been facilitated by recommendations from Summit Operations Solutions. 3 of the companies he was developing relationships with were actually existing clients of mine who'd asked for introductions to Davidson Industries, specifically because they'd been impressed with consulting work I'd done for them. The expansion plans he was proposing were built on operational efficiencies that I'd already identified and quietly implemented over the previous 18 months. By year 4, Summit Operations Solutions had grown into a network of 3 interconnected consulting firms: Summit Operations, Precision Logistics Consulting, and Strategic Supply Solutions. Together, we were managing supply chain optimization projects for 43 companies across 12 states, generating revenue that exceeded my salary at Davidson Industries by a factor of 8. But I kept showing up to my operations manager job every morning at 7:30, kept driving my Honda, kept living in my townhouse, and kept listening to Marcus explain business concepts to me like I was a child who'd stumbled into the corporate world by accident. The consulting work had taught me something crucial about Davidson Industries. We weren't just another mid-sized manufacturer competing for market share. We were positioned at the center of a supply chain network that could be leveraged into something much more significant. Our client base included companies that supplied materials to our competitors, and our competitors included companies that could benefit from our specialized manufacturing capabilities. There were partnership opportunities, acquisition possibilities, and market expansion strategies that nobody at Davidson Industries had ever considered because they were all focused on traditional growth models. But implementing these strategies would require someone with operational expertise, industry relationships, and the kind of big-picture thinking that came from managing complex systems under pressure. It would require someone who understood both the manufacturing floor and the boardroom, someone who could coordinate between multiple companies and multiple interests simultaneously. It would require exactly the kind of experience I'd gained, from 12 years in military logistics and 4 years of consulting work. The problem was that Marcus had already been designated as Dad's successor. The board had been prepared for years to hand him the CEO position when Dad decided to retire. Marcus had the relationships with key board members, the industry profile, and the complete confidence that came from never having been challenged. He also had something I didn't have, the absolute certainty that he deserved to be in charge. Which is why nobody saw what was coming in the boardroom that night. They couldn't see it because they'd never bothered to look past their assumptions about who belonged in leadership and who belonged in supporting roles. They'd never questioned whether the person with the MBA and the networking skills was actually the person best equipped to lead the company into its next phase of growth. Marcus was about to find out that all the confidence in the world couldn't substitute for actual competence, and all the networking in the world couldn't protect you when the people who really understood the business decided it was time for a change. The quarterly board meeting started exactly as they always did, with Marcus commanding the room like he was born to it. He stood at the presentation screen in his navy Tom Ford suit, laser pointer in hand, walking through slides that detailed our third-quarter performance with the kind of confidence that came from never having to question whether he belonged there. The 12 board members sat around the polished conference table, their attention focused on charts showing revenue growth, market penetration, and projected expansion opportunities. As you can see, Marcus said, clicking to a slide showing our sales figures, we've exceeded our quarterly targets by 18%. Marking our 6th consecutive quarter of growth under my leadership of the sales division. He paused for effect, letting the numbers sink in before continuing. Our strategic partnerships with Midwest Manufacturing and Great Lakes Components have opened up entirely new revenue streams, and our market share in the agricultural equipment sector has increased by 12% year over year. I sat in my usual spot at the far end of the table, the operations manager's chair that might as well have been labeled support staff. My role in these meetings was to provide logistical updates when asked, answer questions about delivery schedules, or supplier issues, and otherwise remain quietly invisible while the real business leaders discuss strategy and vision. I'd learned to bring a legal pad and take notes, not because I needed them, but because it gave me something to do with my hands while I listened to Marcus take credit for improvements that had originated from operational changes he'd never bothered to understand. Dad presided over the meeting from his position at the head of the table, his 70-year-old frame still carrying the authority of someone who'd built this company from nothing. He wore the same style of conservative gray suit he'd worn to every board meeting for the past decade, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression alternating between pride when he looked at Marcus and benevolent tolerance when his eyes landed on me. Robert Davidson had worked 18-hour days for 40 years to build Davidson Industries into what it was today, and he'd always assumed that his legacy would be safe in the hands of his MBA-educated son who understood markets and strategy, and all the sophisticated aspects of modern business leadership. "Sarah," Marcus said, turning toward me with that patronizing smile he'd perfected over the years, "why don't you give the board an update on our operational efficiency metrics? I know you've been working hard to keep our costs under control." The way he said it made it sound like I was some kind of budget-conscious bookkeeper, carefully counting pennies while the real leaders focused on big-picture growth strategies. Glanced down at my notes, though I could have recited these numbers from memory. Third-quarter operational costs decreased by 14% compared to the same period last year, I said evenly. Delivery times improved by an average of 38% across all product lines. We've reduced material waste by 22% and improved our on-time delivery rate to 96%, up from 81% last year. Board member Patricia Hendricks, who owned a chain of agricultural equipment dealerships throughout the Midwest, raised an eyebrow. "Those are impressive numbers, Sarah. What's driving the improvements?" Before I could answer, Marcus jumped in smoothly. "It's really a testament to our integrated approach to growth," he said. When you improve sales relationships and strategic partnerships, the operational efficiencies naturally follow. Sarah's done good work implementing the systems we've put in place, but the real driver is our market positioning strategy. Several board members nodded approvingly. This was the Marcus they'd come to expect. Quick to take credit, smooth with explanations, always ready to connect operational details to larger strategic visions. He had a gift for making everything sound like it was part of his master plan, even when he had no idea how the actual improvements had been achieved. The key, Marcus continued, warming to his theme, is understanding that operations and sales aren't separate departments. They're integrated components of a comprehensive business strategy. When I negotiate partnerships with companies like Midwest Manufacturing, I'm not just thinking about immediate sales opportunities. I'm thinking about how those relationships can drive operational improvements, supply chain optimizations, and long-term competitive advantages. I kept my expression neutral, though internally I was cataloging the inaccuracies in his statement. Marcus had never set foot in our primary manufacturing facility. He'd never attended a single meeting with our key suppliers. He couldn't have identified our top 3 operational bottlenecks if his life depended on it. But he could certainly talk about operational improvements like he'd personally engineered every efficiency gain we'd achieved. Board member James Morrison, who'd served on our board for 8 years and owned a successful logistics company, leaned forward with interest. Marcus, can you walk us through some specific examples of how your strategic partnerships have translated into operational improvements? This was where things got interesting. Marcus had no specific examples because he'd never been involved in the actual implementation of any operational changes, but he was far too smooth to let that stop him. Absolutely, he said without missing a beat. Take our relationship with Great Lakes Components. When I negotiated that partnership, I specifically structured it to create mutual supply chain benefits. They needed reliable delivery schedules for their component orders, and we needed more predictable material costs for our raw steel purchases. By aligning our operational capabilities with their supply needs, we created a win-win situation that improved efficiency metrics for both companies. It was a masterful explanation that contained just enough truth to sound plausible while completely omitting the fact that the Great Lakes Components partnership had been my idea, developed through my consulting relationships, and implemented through operational changes that Marcus had never been involved in. He'd showed up to the final contract signing and taken credit for the entire arrangement. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that sets us apart from our competitors, said board member Carol Zhang, who ran a private equity firm specializing in manufacturing investments. It's not enough to just focus on sales numbers or operational metrics in isolation. You need leadership that can see the bigger picture and connect all the pieces. Marcus positively glowed under the praise. That's been my philosophy from day one, he said. Sarah does excellent work keeping our day-to-day operations running smoothly, but someone needs to be thinking about where we're going to be in 5 years, 10 years. Someone needs to be building the relationships and partnerships that will drive our next phase of growth. The implicit message was clear. I was the detail-oriented operations person who kept the trains running on time, while Marcus was the visionary leader who actually understood business strategy. It was a dynamic that had been established years ago and reinforced in every board meeting, every company presentation, and every industry conference where Marcus represented Davidson Industries as the heir apparent to our father's legacy. Speaking of our next phase of growth, Dad said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was ready to make an important announcement, I think it's time we started having serious discussions about succession planning. I'll be 71 next month, and Martha and I want to spend more time at the lake house. We've been talking about transitioning to an advisory role rather than day-to-day management. The room fell silent. Everyone knew this conversation was coming, but hearing Dad actually say it out loud made it real. Marcus straightened in his chair, his expression shifting from confident to intensely focused. This was the moment he'd been preparing for his entire career. "I've given this a lot of consideration," Dad continued, "and I think we all know that Marcus has demonstrated the kind of leadership capabilities and strategic vision that Davidson Industries needs going forward. He's built relationships throughout the industry, he understands our market position, and he's shown consistent results in driving growth and profitability." Marcus tried to look humble, but I could see the satisfaction in his eyes. This was his coronation moment, the official acknowledgement of what everyone in the room had always assumed. He was the chosen successor, the rightful heir to the company Dad had built from nothing. Of course, any transition would need to be approved by the board, Dad said, glancing around the table. But I wanted to open the discussion and get everyone's thoughts on how we might structure a leadership transition over the next 12 to 18 months. Board member Patricia Hendricks was the first to speak. "I think we all recognize Marcus's contributions to the company's success," she said diplomatically. "His sales leadership has been instrumental in our recent growth, and he's certainly demonstrated the kind of industry relationships that are crucial for long-term success. The question," added James Morrison, "is whether we want to consider other transition models. Some companies benefit from promoting operational expertise to senior leadership, especially in manufacturing environments where efficiency and process optimization are becoming increasingly important competitive advantages." I felt every eye in the room turned toward me, though the suggestion felt more like polite consideration than serious interest. Marcus's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, the first sign of tension I'd seen from him all morning. "Sarah's certainly done good work in operations," Marcus said smoothly. "But I think we need to be realistic about the different skill sets required for operational management versus strategic leadership. Running day-to-day operations and setting company direction are two completely different challenges." The dismissal was gentle but definitive. I was competent within my limited scope, but I lacked the broader vision and strategic thinking required for real leadership. It was the same message Marcus had been sending for years, delivered with just enough respect to avoid seeming openly condescending. "I agree that different roles require different skill sets," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since my operational update. "The question is whether we're accurately assessing what skill sets will be most important for Davidson Industries' future success." Marcus's smile became slightly more forced. "What do you mean by that, Sarah?" I looked around the table at the board members who'd been making assumptions about my capabilities for years, who'd never bothered to ask what I actually did during those long evenings and weekends when I wasn't in the office. "I mean that the manufacturing industry is changing rapidly, and some of the traditional approaches to business leadership might not be as effective as they used to be." The room was quiet, waiting to see where I was going with this. Marcus looked like he was preparing to redirect the conversation back to safer territory. "But that's a conversation for another time," I said with a slight smile. "I'm sure we all want to think carefully about what's best for the company's future." Marcus relaxed, visibly interpreting my retreat as an acknowledgement that I knew my place in the hierarchy. The discussion moved on to other topics, and the meeting concluded with the general understanding that Marcus would be taking over as CEO within the next year. What none of them realized was that I'd just fired the opening shot in a war they didn't even know was coming. The contrast between Marcus and me had been deliberately cultivated over years of family dinners, company events, and industry gatherings where we were inevitably introduced as Robert Davidson's children. Marcus would stride into rooms wearing his tailored suits and Swiss watches, carrying himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. His handshake was firm, his smile was practiced, and his conversation flowed effortlessly from college football to market trends to the latest luxury vacation he'd taken with his wife Jennifer. I would follow quietly behind in my sensible business, attire, practical shoes, and the kind of understated jewelry that suggested competence rather than wealth. When people asked what I did at Davidson Industries, I'd explain that I managed operations, which usually prompted polite nods and rapid shifts of attention back to Marcus, who could discuss strategic partnerships and market expansion with the kind of enthusiasm that made investors lean forward in their chairs. The differences between us weren't just professional. They were carefully constructed lifestyle choices that reinforced everyone's assumptions about who was destined for leadership and who was content with a supporting role. Marcus lived in a 3,000-square-foot penthouse in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, imported marble countertops, and a wine collection that he loved to discuss with potential business partners. His garage housed a BMW M5 and a vintage Porsche that he'd restored as a weekend hobby. My townhouse in Arlington Heights was a 15-minute drive from the office, chosen for its proximity to work rather than its prestige address. 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a modest kitchen with standard appliances, and a 2-car garage that housed my Honda Accord, and a collection of camping gear left over from my military days. When colleagues asked about my living situation, I'd describe it as practical and convenient, which was true enough, though it reinforced their perception of me as someone who prioritized function over form and had simple, unambitious tastes. Marcus's social calendar was a carefully orchestrated series of networking events, charity galas, and industry conferences where he could build relationships with potential clients and strategic partners. He belonged to the Chicago Athletic Association, played golf at Medina Country Club, and attended wine tastings and art gallery openings with the kind of people who made decisions about million-dollar contracts over cocktails and appetizers. His LinkedIn profile was a masterpiece of professional positioning, complete with recommendations from industry leaders and photographs from speaking engagements at manufacturing conferences. My evenings and weekends appeared to be spent in quiet solitude, declining invitations to company social events and industry networking functions in favor of what everyone assumed was a simple, private lifestyle. Colleagues who tried to include me in after-work gatherings eventually stopped asking when I consistently explained that I had other commitments. The assumption was that those other commitments involved Netflix, takeout food, and the kind of solitary activities that single, middle-aged women engaged in when they'd given up on building impressive careers or exciting personal lives. The perception extended to our educational backgrounds and professional development approaches. Marcus had graduated magna cum laude from Northwestern University with a degree in economics, then immediately entered the MBA program at Yale School of Management, where he'd networked with future business leaders and learned the theoretical frameworks that guided modern corporate strategy. His transcript included coursework in advanced financial modeling, international business strategy, and organizational leadership theory. He spoke fluently about market positioning, competitive advantage, and stakeholder management, because he'd spent 2 years studying these concepts with professors who consulted for Fortune 500 companies. My educational credentials were viewed as less relevant to business leadership. Bachelor's degree in logistics management from a state university, followed by 12 years of practical experience in military supply chain operations. No MBA, no business school networks, no exposure to the sophisticated strategic thinking that modern companies required. My professional development consisted of military training programs, certifications in supply chain management, and the kind of hands-on experience that was valuable for operational roles, but didn't qualify someone for executive leadership. The financial comparison was perhaps the most telling indicator of our supposed success levels. Marcus earned a base salary of $250,000 as vice president of sales and marketing, plus performance bonuses that had averaged another $100,000 annually over the past 3 years. His compensation package included stock options, a company car allowance, and membership fees for his country club and professional associations. He and Jennifer owned their penthouse outright, having leveraged his bonuses and stock options into smart real estate investments that appreciated steadily in Chicago's competitive housing market. My operations manager salary was $68,000, plus a modest annual bonus that usually amounted to less than $5,000. No stock options, no car allowance, no expense account for entertaining clients or attending conferences. I'd purchased my townhouse with a 30-year mortgage and drove a car that was practical rather than impressive. From the outside, it appeared that Marcus had built the kind of financial success that came with strategic thinking and business acumen, while I'd settled for the steady but limited income of someone who was content with middle management. These financial disparities were reinforced by our spending patterns and lifestyle choices. Marcus and Jennifer took annual vacations to European wine regions, luxury resorts in the Caribbean, and ski trips to Aspen where they could network with other successful couples. They attended charity events where $1,000 per plate dinners were routine, and Marcus spoke casually about purchasing artwork or upgrading their kitchen with appliances that cost more than many people's cars. My vacation time appeared to be spent visiting national parks, taking modest trips to visit military friends in other states, and engaging in the kind of budget-conscious travel that suggested someone who needed to carefully manage limited financial resources. I drove a 10-year-old Honda, shopped at Target rather than Nordstrom, and lived in a neighborhood where success meant owning a small house rather than accumulating luxury possessions. The professional recognition Marcus received further emphasized the gap between our career trajectories. Industry publications regularly featured him in articles about rising leaders in manufacturing, young executives to watch, and innovative approaches to sales strategy. He'd been invited to speak at 3 major conferences in the past year, sharing panels with CEOs from companies much larger than Davidson Industries. The Chicago Business Journal had named him to their 40 under 40 list of influential young business leaders, complete with a photo shoot and interview about his vision for the future of American manufacturing. His office reflected his status as the heir apparent to company leadership. Corner location on the executive floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, mahogany desk, leather chairs for client meetings, and walls displaying his MBA diploma, industry awards, and photographs from speaking engagements. When important visitors toured Davidson Industries, they were inevitably introduced to Marcus as the strategic visionary who was driving the company's growth and expansion plans. My workspace was located on the second floor with the other operational staff, a modest office with standard furniture, filing cabinets filled with supplier contracts and delivery schedules, and walls decorated with operational flowcharts and efficiency metrics that meant nothing to visitors who were interested in big-picture strategy rather than day-to-day logistics. When tours included the operations area, I was usually introduced as Sarah Davidson, who keeps everything running smoothly behind the scenes. The networking and relationship-building aspects of our roles created additional layers of contrast. Marcus had developed personal relationships with executives at dozens of companies throughout the manufacturing sector. He knew their children's names, their golf handicaps, their vacation preferences, and their long-term business goals. These relationships translated into contracts, partnerships, and strategic opportunities that reinforced his reputation as someone who understood how business really worked in competitive markets. My professional relationships appeared to be limited to suppliers, plant managers, and the kind of operational personnel who were essential for day-to-day business functions, but weren't decision-makers in strategic planning processes. I attended industry conferences focused on logistics and supply chain management, rather than the high-level strategic gatherings where CEOs and board members discussed market trends and expansion opportunities. Even our approaches to problem-solving and decision-making reinforced the perception that Marcus was leadership material while I was support staff. When challenges arose, Marcus would schedule meetings with multiple stakeholders, create presentations analyzing different strategic options, and facilitate discussions that resulted in consensus building and buy-in from key decision-makers. His solutions were collaborative, well-documented, and implemented through formal change management processes that ensured everyone understood their roles and responsibilities. My problem-solving style appeared more direct and less sophisticated. When operational issues arose, I would identify the root cause, develop a solution, and implement changes through direct communication with the people who needed to modify their processes. No PowerPoint presentations, No stakeholder meetings, no formal change management protocols. I would simply figure out what needed to be done and make it happen, which was effective, but didn't demonstrate the kind of strategic thinking and leadership, skills that impressed board members and senior executives. The cumulative effect of these comparisons was a clear narrative about our relative value to Davidson Industries and our potential for future leadership roles. Marcus represented the modern business leader, educated, connected, strategic, and sophisticated in his approach to growth and market positioning. He understood finance, marketing, relationship building, and the complex decision-making processes that successful companies required in competitive environments. I represented competent operational support, reliable, efficient, and valuable within a limited scope, but lacking the broader vision and strategic capabilities that executive leadership demanded. I was the kind of employee who could be trusted to implement decisions made by others, but not someone who should be making strategic decisions that would determine the company's future direction. This narrative had been so consistently reinforced over so many years that it had become accepted truth among board members, industry colleagues, and even family members who worked in the business. It was the foundation for every assumption about succession planning, compensation structures, and role assignments within Davidson Industries. What made the narrative so powerful was that it contained enough surface truth to seem obviously accurate, while completely missing the deeper reality of what was actually happening behind the scenes. The conversation about my future at Davidson Industries began 3 days after the board meeting, when Dad knocked on my office door with the kind of gentle expression he wore when he thought he was about to solve someone's problems. He'd changed out of his usual business attire into khakis and a polo shirt, the casual Friday look that was supposed to signal approachability and fatherly concern rather than executive authority. "Sarah, do you have a few minutes?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk without waiting for an answer. I wanted to follow up on our discussion at the board meeting. I know this transition period might feel uncertain for you, and I don't want you to worry about your place in the company. I saved the supplier contract I'd been reviewing and gave him my full attention, though I already knew where this conversation was heading. Dad had always been protective of me in his own way, but his protection came wrapped in assumptions about what I needed and what I was capable of handling. He saw me as the daughter who'd tried the military route, come home needing stability, and settled into a role that was safe but limiting. "Marcus and I have been talking," Dad continued, "and we both agree that you bring tremendous value to Davidson Industries. Your operational expertise, your attention to detail, your reliability, those are exactly the qualities we need to maintain our competitive edge. But we also recognize that you might want opportunities for growth and advancement as the company evolves." The setup was perfect. Dad genuinely believed he was offering me career development opportunities while simultaneously reinforcing the boundaries of what those opportunities could realistically include. He wasn't trying to be condescending. He was trying to be helpful within the framework of what he understood about my capabilities and ambitions. "We've been thinking about creating a new position," he said, leaning forward with the enthusiasm of someone who thought he'd found an elegant solution to a complex problem. "Director of Operational Excellence. It would be a significant step up from your current role, with a salary increase and broader responsibilities for overseeing efficiency, improvements across all our facilities." I nodded thoughtfully, as if I were seriously considering the implications of this promotion. "What would that look like in terms of day-to-day responsibilities?" "You'd be working directly with Marcus to identify operational improvements that support our strategic growth initiatives," Dad explained. "You know how much he values your input on logistics and efficiency metrics. This would formalize that relationship and give you a voice in the planning process for our expansion projects." The offer was genuinely well-intentioned and represented a significant advancement within the operational hierarchy. Director of Operational Excellence would come with a salary bump to probably $90,000, a larger office, and the kind of title that suggested real responsibility. It would also position me as Marcus's senior operational advisor, someone who could influence how strategic decisions were implemented without threatening his authority over strategic direction. It's an interesting opportunity, I said carefully. I'd want to understand how the role would fit into the broader organizational structure, especially as Marcus transitions into the CEO position. Dad smiled, pleased that I was engaging with his proposal rather than dismissing it outright. That's exactly the right question to ask. The way we see it, Marcus will need a strong operational leader who can translate his strategic vision into practical implementation plans. Someone who understands both the big picture and the detailed execution requirements. This was the heart of their vision for my future, the highly competent second-in-command who could make Marcus's ideas work in the real world. I would be the detail-oriented implementer who ensured that strategic initiatives actually produced the results they promised. It was a role that required significant expertise and carried meaningful responsibility, but it was fundamentally a supporting position that would never threaten the established hierarchy. We're also thinking about additional education opportunities, Dad added, pulling a brochure from his jacket pocket. Northwestern has an executive education program for operational leaders in manufacturing companies. 6 months of weekend seminars covering advanced logistics, quality management, and cross-functional team leadership. The company would cover all the costs, and you'd graduate with a certificate that would strengthen your credentials for senior operational roles. The Northwestern program was legitimate and would provide valuable training for someone who wanted to advance within operational management. It was also a clear signal about the trajectory Dad envisioned for my career development. I would become more educated and more credible within my field of expertise, but I wouldn't be developing the strategic thinking and business leadership skills that qualified someone for executive positions. I appreciate you thinking about my professional development, I said, genuinely touched by his concern, even as I recognized the limitations embedded in his offer. These are definitely opportunities worth considering. Dad relaxed, interpreting my response as enthusiasm for the path he'd outlined. Marcus is excited about the possibility of working more closely with you, he said. He's always respected your operational expertise, and he knows that having strong operational leadership will be crucial for the company's continued growth. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's excitement about working more closely with me was based on his complete ignorance of what I actually did with my time and expertise. He was excited about having a competent subordinate who could handle implementation details while he focused on the strategic thinking that he believed was his unique contribution to company leadership. Later that afternoon, Marcus himself appeared in my office doorway, radiating the confident energy of someone who was about to demonstrate his leadership skills through thoughtful delegation and team building. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, the casual gesture that was supposed to signal collaborative accessibility rather than hierarchical authority. "Sarah, I'm glad Dad talked to you about the director position," he said, settling into the same chair Dad had occupied earlier. "I wanted to follow up and share some thoughts about how we might structure the role to maximize your impact on company operations." Marcus had clearly prepared for this conversation, pulling out a leather portfolio that contained handwritten notes about organizational charts, reporting structures, and performance metrics. He approached the discussion like a consulting project, systematically working through the logical framework for how my expanded role would integrate with his strategic leadership. "The way I see it," Marcus began, "operational excellence is going to be increasingly important as we scale the business. We're looking at potential acquisitions, new market segments, and partnerships that will require sophisticated coordination between multiple facilities and supply chains. Someone needs to own that complexity and ensure that our operational capabilities can support our growth ambitions." It was a compelling vision that demonstrated Marcus's ability to think systematically about organizational design and resource allocation. He genuinely understood that operational excellence was important, and he recognized that scaling complex businesses required specialized expertise that he didn't personally possess. What he didn't understand was the difference between managing operational complexity and creating operational strategy. "I'm particularly interested in your thoughts about performance measurement," Marcus continued, flipping to a page covered with charts and metrics. "How do we create accountability systems that ensure operational improvements directly support our revenue growth and market expansion goals?" The question revealed both Marcus's strengths and his blind spots. He understood that performance measurement was important, and he could think systematically about how different metrics should align with strategic objectives. But he was asking me to design measurement systems for operational improvements that I had already implemented, partnerships that I had already established, and efficiency gains that I had already achieved. Performance measurement is definitely crucial, I agreed. The challenge is making sure you're measuring the right things and that your metrics actually drive the behaviors that create sustainable competitive advantages. Marcus nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. And that's where I think your operational expertise combined with strategic oversight can create real value. I can provide the market perspective and growth strategy, and you can translate that into specific operational targets and improvement initiatives. The division of labor he was proposing made perfect sense within his framework of understanding our respective capabilities. He would handle strategy, vision, and market positioning, while I would handle execution, implementation, and process optimization. It was a partnership that played to our supposed strengths while maintaining clear boundaries around decision-making authority and organizational hierarchy. There's also the question of external relationships, Marcus said, turning to another page of notes. I know you've developed good working relationships with our key suppliers and logistics partners. As Director of Operational Excellence, you'd have more authority to negotiate improvements in those relationships and explore new partnership opportunities that support our operational goals. This was where Marcus's lack of awareness about my actual activities became almost comical. He was offering me permission to develop supplier relationships and explore partnership opportunities that I had been creating and managing for years through my consulting work. He was essentially offering to let me do officially what I was already doing unofficially, without realizing that my unofficial work had generated more value than Davidson Industries' entire sales operation. Supplier relationships are definitely important, I said neutrally. I'd want to make sure any new partnerships align with our long-term strategic objectives. Absolutely, Marcus agreed. And that's where the communication between operational and strategic leadership becomes so crucial. I'd want regular updates on potential partnership opportunities, so we can evaluate them against our market positioning and growth priorities. The reporting structure he was envisioning would have me providing him with information about partnerships and opportunities that he would then evaluate and approve based on strategic considerations that I had already analyzed more thoroughly than he could imagine. I would be asking permission to pursue opportunities that I had already identified, developed, and in many cases implemented through my consulting relationships. We should also talk about the team-building aspect, Marcus said, moving to his final page of notes. As Director of Operational Excellence, you'd probably want to hire additional staff to support expanded responsibilities. I'm thinking maybe 2 or 3 analysts who can help with data collection, process mapping, and performance tracking. The team expansion he was proposing would give me resources to manage operational improvements that were already generating results through systems I had developed independently. I would be hiring staff to document and maintain processes that I had created without organizational support, using company resources to formalize work that I had been doing successfully on my own time. Team development is definitely worth considering, I said. I'd want to think carefully about what skills and experience would be most valuable for supporting operational excellence initiatives. Marcus closed his portfolio with the satisfaction of someone who had thought through a complex problem and developed a comprehensive solution. I'm really excited about this, Sarah. I think you have the potential to build something genuinely impactful in this role. The operational excellence function could become a real competitive differentiator for Davidson Industries. The enthusiasm in his voice was genuine. Marcus truly believed that he was offering me an opportunity to fulfill my potential and make meaningful contributions to the company's success. He had no idea that he was essentially offering me a chance to recreate, with organizational support and formal authority, a smaller version of what I had already built independently with better results. "There's one more thing I wanted to mention," Marcus said, standing up and straightening his tie. "Dad and I have been talking about succession planning, not just for the CEO position, but for other senior leadership roles as well. If you excel in the Director of Operational Excellence position, there could be opportunities down the road for even greater responsibilities. Maybe Chief Operating Officer in 5 or 6 years, if the company continues growing, and we need that level of operational leadership." The long-term career path he was outlining represented the absolute pinnacle of what someone with my background and experience could realistically hope to achieve within a traditional organizational structure. Chief Operating Officer at a successful manufacturing company would be a significant accomplishment for anyone, and particularly impressive for someone who had started in entry-level operations management. It was also a ceiling that would keep me permanently subordinate to Marcus and any future CEO who inherited the company after him. I would be the senior operational leader who implemented strategic decisions made by others, who optimized processes designed by others, and who managed complexity created by others' vision and planning. "That's definitely something to think about," I said with a slight smile. "I appreciate you and Dad taking the time to think through these development opportunities." Marcus left my office clearly satisfied that he had handled a potentially delicate situation with appropriate sensitivity and strategic thinking. He had offered me meaningful advancement, additional resources, and a clear path for long-term career growth within an organizational structure that valued my expertise while maintaining appropriate boundaries around strategic decision-making authority. What he didn't realize was that he had just offered me a promotion to a job that would have represented a significant step backward from what I was already accomplishing outside his awareness and beyond his understanding. What Marcus and Dad didn't know, what no board member had ever suspected, was that those quiet evenings in my modest townhouse were actually spent managing the most sophisticated supply chain consulting operation in the Midwest. While they assumed I was settling into the comfortable routine of middle-aged spinsterhood, I was conducting video conferences with CEOs from companies across 12 states, analyzing operational inefficiencies that were costing manufacturers millions of dollars annually, and building a network of strategic relationships that would have impressed even Marcus if he'd had any idea they existed. The transformation had begun during my second year at Davidson Industries, when I realized that the operational improvements I was implementing weren't particularly sophisticated or revolutionary. They were simply applications of basic logistics principles that I'd learned during 12 years of managing supply chains in environments where inefficiency could literally get people killed. What surprised me wasn't that these improvements worked, but that apparently no one else in the manufacturing sector was implementing them systematically. That insight led to my first consulting contract, a small project with a regional agricultural equipment manufacturer who was struggling with delivery delays and cost overruns. The company's operations manager, someone I'd met at a supply chain conference, asked if I could spend a weekend reviewing their processes and offering suggestions for improvement. I'd expected to find minor inefficiencies that could be corrected, with some procedural adjustments. Instead, I discovered systematic problems that were costing them nearly $2 million annually in unnecessary expenses and lost productivity. The solutions weren't complex. They involved renegotiating supplier contracts to include performance incentives, restructuring delivery schedules to minimize transportation costs, and implementing inventory management systems that reduced both waste and storage expenses. Within 6 months of implementing my recommendations, the company had improved their operational efficiency by 38% and increased their profit margins by nearly 15%. More importantly for my future, they were so impressed with the results that they started recommending my services to other manufacturers in their network. Summit Operation Solutions began as a simple side business, something I could manage during evenings and weekends without interfering with my responsibilities at Davidson Industries. I registered the company under my name, set up a separate bank account, and started taking on small consulting projects that could be completed remotely or during vacation days. The work was intellectually satisfying and financially rewarding. But more than that, it was giving me insights into industry-wide patterns that were invisible to people who worked within individual companies. By year 3, I was managing consulting relationships with 15 different manufacturing companies, ranging from small regional operations to mid-sized corporations with facilities in multiple states. The diversity of these relationships was teaching me something crucial about the manufacturing sector. Most companies were dealing with identical operational challenges, but they were all trying to solve them independently rather than leveraging shared solutions and strategic partnerships. This realization led to the expansion of Summit Operations into what became a network of 3 interconnected consulting firms. Summit Operations Solutions focused on internal process optimization and efficiency improvements. Precision Logistics Consulting specialized in transportation and supply chain coordination between multiple companies. Strategic Supply Solutions developed partnership agreements and collaborative arrangements that allowed manufacturers to share resources and reduce costs through coordinated purchasing and production scheduling. The 3 companies operated independently, but shared information and resources in ways that created comprehensive solutions for complex operational challenges. A client might hire Summit Operations to optimize their internal processes, then work with Precision Logistics to improve their supplier relationships, and finally engage Strategic Supply Solutions to develop partnerships with other manufacturers that would reduce costs and improve market positioning for all participants. What made this approach particularly effective was that I was simultaneously working with companies at different levels of the supply chain. I might be optimizing production processes for a component manufacturer while also improving distribution logistics for the companies that purchase their products. This gave me unprecedented visibility into inefficiencies and opportunities that existed between companies rather than within individual operations. The financial results exceeded anything I'd expected when I started the consulting work. By year 4, the 3 companies were generating combined annual revenue of over $2 million, with profit margins that reflected the value I was creating for clients, rather than the time I was spending on individual projects. I was earning more from my consulting work than Marcus was making in his executive position at Davidson Industries. And I was building a reputation within the industry that would have shocked anyone who knew me only as the quiet operations manager, who kept to herself. But the financial success was less important than the strategic insights I was developing about the manufacturing sector and Davidson Industries' position within it. Through my consulting relationships, I was learning that our company was positioned at the center of a supply chain network that could be leveraged into something much more significant than anyone at Davidson Industries realized. 3 of our largest clients were actually suppliers to companies that I was working with through Strategic Supply Solutions. 2 of our key suppliers were subsidiaries of corporations that were clients of Summit Operations Solutions. Our biggest competitor in the agricultural equipment sector was struggling with operational inefficiencies that I had already solved for similar companies, creating opportunities for strategic partnerships that could benefit everyone involved. More importantly, I was identifying acquisition opportunities and market expansion possibilities that aligned perfectly with Davidson Industries' operational capabilities and financial resources. There were regional manufacturers that would benefit from our production expertise, distribution companies that could expand our market reach, and technology firms that had developed solutions for problems we didn't even know we had. The consulting work had also taught me something crucial about business leadership and strategic planning. Most of the CEOs and senior executives I worked with were intelligent, well-educated people who understood their markets and their competition. but they were all focused on their individual companies rather than the broader ecosystem of relationships and opportunities that connected manufacturers throughout the region. This narrow focus meant they were missing strategic possibilities that were obvious once you had visibility into multiple companies and supply chains simultaneously. They were competing with companies they could be partnering with, purchasing materials from suppliers who could benefit from operational improvements, and missing market opportunities that existed in the spaces between different industry sectors. What I'd learned from my consulting work was that the most valuable strategic thinking wasn't about positioning individual companies for competitive advantage. It was about identifying ways to create value for entire networks of companies through coordinated improvements and collaborative relationships. The companies that would dominate their markets in the future wouldn't be the ones that competed most effectively, but the ones that facilitated collaboration most strategically. This insight had profound implications for Davidson Industries' future. We weren't just a mid-sized manufacturer competing for market share in the agricultural equipment sector. We were positioned at the center of a supply chain network that could be transformed into an integrated partnership that would benefit everyone involved while creating unprecedented value for the company that facilitated the integration. But implementing this vision would require someone with operational expertise, industry relationships, and the kind of systems thinking that came from managing complex networks under pressure. It would require exactly the kind of experience I'd gained from 12 years in military logistics and 4 years of consulting work that nobody at Davidson Industries knew about. The irony was that Marcus had been unconsciously building his strategic relationships and market positioning on the foundation of operational improvements and partnership opportunities that I had created through my consulting work. The efficiency gains he took credit for, the supplier relationships he leveraged, and the strategic partnerships he celebrated were all built on insights and connections that originated from work I was doing outside the company. 3 of the strategic partnerships that Marcus was most proud of had been facilitated by recommendations from companies that were clients of Strategic Supply Solutions. The operational efficiency improvements that were driving our competitive advantage had been developed and tested through consulting projects before being implemented at Davidson Industries. Even the market expansion opportunities that Marcus was pursuing had been identified through my analysis of industry patterns and supply chain networks. Marcus genuinely believed that he was the strategic visionary who was driving Davidson Industries' growth and success. He had no idea that he was essentially implementing a smaller, less sophisticated version of strategies that I had already developed and proven effective through my consulting work with much larger and more complex operations. The consulting network had also given me something that Marcus would never have access to through his traditional business relationships: real influence over the strategic decisions being made by dozens of companies throughout the manufacturing sector. When I recommended partnership opportunities, companies pursued them. When I suggested operational improvements, they implemented them. When I identified market opportunities, they allocated resources to capitalize on them. This influence was invisible to people who only saw me as Davidson Industries operations manager, but it was becoming increasingly significant within the broader industry ecosystem. I was quietly coordinating improvements and partnerships that were reshaping competitive dynamics and market relationships in ways that even the participating companies didn't fully understand. The most satisfying aspect of this hidden influence was that it was based entirely on results rather than titles, relationships, or organizational authority. Companies worked with my consulting firms because the recommendations produced measurable improvements in efficiency, profitability, and market positioning. They trusted my strategic insights because those insights consistently created value for their operations and their bottom-line performance. What I was building through the consulting network was exactly what Marcus thought he was building through his sales relationships and strategic partnerships: influence over industry direction and competitive positioning. The difference was that my influence was based on operational excellence and demonstrated results, while his influence was based on personal relationships and theoretical strategic thinking. The consulting work had taught me that Marcus's approach to business leadership, while impressive and sophisticated, was fundamentally limited by his focus on individual company positioning rather than network-level optimization. He was trying to win competitive advantages for Davidson Industries, while I was creating collaborative advantages for entire groups of companies that included Davidson Industries as a central coordinating entity. This difference in strategic perspective had profound implications for succession planning and leadership development at Davidson Industries. The company's future success wouldn't depend on someone who could negotiate better deals or build stronger relationships with individual clients. It would depend on someone who could coordinate improvements and partnerships across multiple companies and supply chains simultaneously. But nobody at Davidson Industries knew that I had already built the operational expertise, industry relationships, and strategic influence that the company would need to capitalize on these network-level opportunities. They saw me as the competent operations manager who could implement decisions made by others, not as the strategic architect who had already designed and tested the systems that would determine the company's future competitive position. The board meeting where Marcus would receive his unofficial coronation as heir apparent was scheduled for the following month. By that time, I would be ready to demonstrate exactly what kind of strategic leadership Davidson Industries actually needed, and why the succession planning process had been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions about capability, influence, and results. What none of them realized was that the quiet operations manager who wore practical shoes and drove a 10-year-old Honda had already built the kind of strategic influence and operational excellence that CEOs of much larger companies could only dream of achieving. The question wasn't whether I was qualified for executive leadership. The question was whether Davidson Industries was ready for the kind of transformation that real strategic leadership could create. Tomorrow would provide the answer to that question, and Marcus was about to discover that all the confidence and networking skills in the world couldn't substitute for actual competence when the people who really understood the business decided it was time for a change. The board would have to choose between the comfortable assumption of traditional leadership qualifications and the uncomfortable reality of proven strategic results. I knew which choice would better serve the company's future, and I was finally ready to give them the information they needed to make that choice intelligently.